The overhead lights inside the Palmetto County Sheriff's substation had always buzzed at a frequency that Derek Colton could feel behind his back teeth. He'd stopped noticing it years ago, the way you stop noticing a neighbor's dog barking or the particular smell of your own house. But tonight, standing at the booking desk while the woman in front of him refused to give him anything, no frustration, no tears, barely even a blink, he noticed it again. The buzz, the flicker on the right panel. The way the fluorescence turned everybody a shade of yellow that made them look like they'd been pickled. She sat in the plastic chair beside the desk with both hands folded in her lap, not cuffed yet. He hadn't made that call yet. Her purse, a plain black leather bag, no brand logo, no fringe, nothing that told you anything, had been placed in a gray plastic bin on the counter beside her. She hadn't objected when he'd asked for it. Hadn't said anything, actually, since she'd asked him twice, quietly, to state the basis for her detention. And he'd told her she knew why, and she'd gone quiet after that, like she was thinking something through. Deputy Morris, who was 26 and had been on the job 14 months and still chewed his lower lip when he was nervous, stood by the far wall pretending to look at the duty roster. Derek picked up her driver's license again. Arizona, Renata Vasquez, 38 years old, or would be in October, 5'4". The photo showed a woman who did not smile for photos, which Derek always found either arrogant or guilty, and he hadn't decided which this one was yet. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, "I'm going to ask you one more time." She raised her eyes to him, brown, steady, the kind of eyes that didn't dart around looking for help. "And I'll tell you one more time," she said, "that there was no marijuana in that vehicle. There is no marijuana on my person. And whatever you believe you smelled, officer." "Sergeant," it came out sharper than he meant it. "Sergeant Colton." She let a beat pass. "Sergeant Colton, whatever you believe you smelled, I'd like to know whether I'm being detained or whether I'm free to go. That's a simple question." "You're being detained." "On what grounds?" "Suspicion of narcotics possession." Based on what I observed." She nodded slowly, like she was making a note of it somewhere internal. Then she looked at her hands and said nothing else. Morris shifted his weight against the wall. Derek set the license down. It had started 2 hours earlier, on Route 9 heading east out of Delwood, on a Tuesday evening in late September when the heat was still hanging on with the particular stubbornness of heat in Caddo Parish. The kind that soaks through upholstery and makes the air taste like warm asphalt and cut grass, and whatever the paper mill 2 towns over was burning that day. Derek had been running his usual patrol loop, the one he'd been running for 11 years since he made sergeant and got the latitude to set his own circuit. Up past the community college, down through the east side residential, out along the highway corridor where the dollar stores and title loan places and the one surviving sit-down restaurant traded customers with the gas stations, and then east on Route 9 as far as the Beaumont Road intersection before turning back. It was a good loop. Quiet enough that he could think, busy enough that something usually presented itself. The vehicle had passed him going the opposite direction, a dark blue Honda Accord, maybe 4 or 5 years old, unremarkable in every way except that its driver had slowed down noticeably when she spotted his cruiser. He'd been parked on the shoulder, engine running, watching the westbound lane out of habit, and he'd watched the Accord drop maybe 8 miles per hour in the span of 100 yards, not slam the brakes, just ease off, the way people do when they're aware of something. He'd pulled a U-turn. He'd run the plates while he followed at a distance. Arizona registration, came back clean, registered to a Renata Vasquez at a Tempe address. He'd followed for a quarter mile before activating his overheads. The Accord had pulled over without drama, quickly, in a clean straight line into the gravel shoulder. He'd approached from the driver's side, tactical habit, one hand loose near his belt, body angled, flashlight on. The window came down before he reached it. She was in business casual clothes that struck him as odd for the time of day out here, dark trousers, a plain gray blouse, flat shoes, no jewelry except small gold studs in her ears. She'd had both hands on the wheel. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" "No sir, I don't." "You were traveling 41 in a 35 zone." She hadn't argued, she'd nodded slightly and said, "I'm sorry, I'll get my license and registration." And she had, efficiently, without the rummaging that made people look anxious or guilty, just reached into the black leather bag on the passenger seat, produced both cards and handed them to him. He'd taken them back to his cruiser, checked again, everything clean, no warrants, no priors, nothing. He'd sat there for a minute looking at the Accord in his rear view at the back of her head through the rear window. He'd gotten back out and walked up. Later, when he thought about what came next, he would tell himself that he'd smelled it. He would say this in the report he'd write an hour after returning to the station, and he would use the specific language he'd learned years ago, a strong odor consistent with marijuana emanating from the interior of the vehicle, which was language precise enough to sound credible and vague enough to be essentially untestable. He'd used it before. It had worked before. The truth was more granular and less dramatic. The truth was that when he'd leaned into the window to hand her documents back and asked if she'd been drinking, she'd said no, he'd noticed something he couldn't quite place. Something that wasn't marijuana, something more like sandalwood maybe, a faint trace of something. And something else he was less willing to examine, which was that Renata Vasquez looked at him the way very few people on Route 9 at 8:30 on a Tuesday evening looked at him, which was the way a person looks at something they're observing rather than experiencing. Clinical was close but not quite right. Measuring was closer. He hadn't liked it. "Ma'am, I'm detecting an odor of marijuana coming from your vehicle. I'm going to ask you to step out." She had looked at him for a moment. "Step out, please." And she had. He'd asked her to stand behind her vehicle while he conducted what he called a consent search, except that he hadn't asked for her consent so much as he'd told her he was going to search the vehicle and waited to see what she'd do. What she'd done was say, calmly, "I do not consent to a search of this vehicle. I have probable cause based on the odor," he'd said. She'd said okay in a tone that didn't mean okay. The search had taken 20 minutes. He'd been thorough, not destructive but thorough. The glove compartment, the center console, under the seats, in the trunk. The trunk had contained one medium-sized suitcase, a canvas tote bag with what turned out to be two legal-sized manila folders, a laptop case, and one pair of women's dress shoes in a zip bag. Nothing under the mat, nothing in the wheel well, nothing in the suitcase except clothing and a toiletry kit. Nothing in the laptop case except a laptop and its charger and a small notebook. And he'd looked through the notebook and found it full of what appeared to be structured notes in a small, neat hand that he hadn't been able to make sense of in the dark. He'd found nothing. He'd looked at the vehicle for a moment. He'd looked at her, standing behind it on the gravel with her arms loose at her sides, not on her phone, not fidgeting, just standing there watching him. He'd told her he was placing her under arrest. She'd said for what specifically? "Suspicion of narcotics possession." "You didn't find any narcotics." "I'm exercising officer discretion based on my observations." She'd held out her wrists. He'd stood there for a moment, staring at the offered wrists, and something in his stomach had moved in a way he didn't acknowledge. He'd cuffed her in front. He told himself it was because she hadn't been combative, and put her in the back of the cruiser. He called for Morris to come out and run the Accord to the impound. And while he waited, he'd sat in the front of the cruiser and listened to the scanner, and tried to recall if he'd ever arrested someone who'd responded to the cuffs by closing their eyes for exactly 2 seconds and then opening them again, like they were resetting something internally, like they were running a calculation. He'd decided she was strange. He'd told himself strange people were worth looking at. The Palmetto County Sheriff's Substation in Delwood was a converted savings and loan building from the early 80s, brick exterior, drop ceilings inside. 3 holding cells in the back that smelled like industrial cleaner and something older and harder to name. The department had gotten a renovation appropriation 3 budget cycles ago, and spent most of it on a new fleet of Tahoes, and a tactical equipment room nobody had used for anything except storing a Costco run of paper towels. Sergeant Derek Colton had been the law in this particular 42-square-mile corridor of the parish for going on a decade and a half. He was not, by the terms of the story he told himself, a bad man. He had citations. He had a commendation from the parish council for his response to the Delacroix warehouse fire in 2019, where he'd helped evacuate 11 workers before the structure went. He had a daughter in middle school who played clarinet and a wife who worked at the pediatric clinic on Baker Street. He coached youth basketball in the winter badly, with genuine effort. What he also had was a tendency, long established and long unchallenged, to to treat the stretch of Route 9 and its surrounding roads as a kind of personal domain where his judgment was the first and last word on most things. This was not unusual in rural Louisiana parishes. It was in fact the water in which most rural law enforcement swam, and Derek Colton had been swimming in it so long that the water no longer registered as water. He was 44. He'd put on weight in his mid-30s and had been managing it unsuccessfully ever since, not obese, but the kind of solid that sat in chairs with purpose and leaned against doorframes and took up space in rooms in a way that had once been useful when he was walking beats and was now just inertia, just habit made physical. He had a round, sun-worn face with deep-set gray eyes that could be kind or could be flat, depending entirely on what he'd decided about you in the first 30 seconds. He'd decided about Renata Vasquez. He decided fast, the way he always did, and the decision had felt right the way decisions made fast usually feel right to men who have never been seriously wrong. What he hadn't decided, what he couldn't know yet, was that the manila folders in the canvas tote bag in the Accord's trunk contained, among other things, 14 months of compiled data on the Palmetto County Sheriff's Department's traffic stop patterns, use of force incidents, complaint dispositions, and overtime expenditures, along with preliminary findings drafted by the FBI's Civil Rights Division that characterized the department's stop-and-search practices as displaying, quote, a statistically significant and persistent disparity in enforcement actions directed at non-white motorists along the Route 9 and Parish Road 7 corridors specifically. The notebook he'd looked at in the dark and not been able to read contained, among other things, Officer Derek Colton's name. It appeared 43 times. At the booking desk, Deputy Morris finally found something useful to do with himself, which was getting a cup of coffee from the machine in the break room, which at least got him out of the room. Derek appreciated it without acknowledging it. I need a phone call, Vasquez said. You'll get your phone call. I'd like it now. When we finish the intake process. She looked at the booking desk, at the half-completed form on the screen, at Derek standing with one hand on the keyboard and one hand on his belt. What's my charge? I told you, suspicion of. Suspicion is not a charge. Suspicion is a threshold for detention. For an arrest and booking, you need a charge. What is the charge, Sergeant Colton? He looked at her. Possession of marijuana, he said. You didn't find any marijuana. I found residue. The silence that followed was maybe 3 seconds. It had a particular quality to it, the kind of silence in which something has changed and the change is not yet named. She held his eyes. Residue, she said. In the center console. She nodded very slowly. He'd found nothing in the center console. There was a receipt from a Chevron in Shreveport and a pack of gum and a phone charger cable, that was it. He told himself the residue observation was defensible. It was always defensible, it was microscopic, it couldn't be disproven without a lab, and by the time a lab got involved, this would already be whatever it was going to be. That was how it worked. Morris came back with 2 coffees and stopped in the doorway, reading the room, and set one cup on the edge of the desk near Vasquez without anyone asking him to. She looked at it. Thank you, she said. Morris went back to his wall, he chewed his lip. The phone call happened at 9:47 in the evening. Derek gave her the booking phone, stood nearby without pretending he wasn't listening. She dialed from memory, 7 digits, local area code 504, New Orleans maybe or somewhere in the metro. The phone rang twice. It's me, she said, pause, no Delwood, pause, Route 9 stop approximately 8:15, pause, yes, her eyes moved to Derek and then away. Colton, Colton, Sergeant, pause, no don't just, she paused again listening. I said don't, notify Hargrove and let him handle the cadence, I'll be out tomorrow. Another pause, I'm fine David, I'm fine. She hung up. Derek looked at the phone then at her. Hargrove, he said because he couldn't help it. Who's that? Someone I work with. Where do you work? She looked at him with those still brown eyes. You have my ID, you booked me, you know where I live. I know where you're registered, that's not the same thing. She didn't confirm or deny that. She picked up the coffee Morris had set down and drank some of it and set it back. Derek booked her at 10:03, printed her, photographed her. She stood against the height marker with her chin level and her eyes on the camera and no expression at all. He put her in the second holding cell. He'd have put her in the first, but the first currently had a man named Terrell Pickett who was sleeping off something and snoring loud enough to rattle the door, and he told her bond would be set in the morning. "I'd like a blanket," she said. "There are blankets in the cell." She looked at the metal bench along the back wall. There was one thin gray blanket folded at the far end. She went and sat down on the bench and unfolded it across her lap and looked at the middle distance. He watched her through the cell door's small window for longer than was necessary. Then he went back to his desk. He wrote his report. The language was careful, experienced. He noted the traffic infraction, the odor, the search, the residue, the arrest. He noted her demeanor as calm and uncooperative. He used both words, knowing that calm would read as suspicious and uncooperative would read as resistant, and together they painted the kind of portrait that served the narrative he needed. He'd written this report, or one nearly identical to it, 7 times in the past 4 years. 6 had resulted in plea deals. 1 had been dropped by the due because the defendant's attorney had been aggressive and the evidence thinner even than this, and Derek had absorbed that one as a cost of doing business and moved on. He sent the report to the Des on-call line as a courtesy notification. He emailed a copy to his watch commander, Captain Ruiz, who was home and would see it in the morning. He locked his desk. He drove home. He slept not well, but he slept. In cell 2, Renata Vasquez did not sleep. She sat on the bench with the thin blanket across her knees and thought through the sequence of events with the particular discipline of a person who has spent 15 years training herself to treat panic as data and data as something manageable. She was not panicked. She was, if she was honest, something closer to tired, and something closer still to a cold, specific fury that she was taking great care not to let go anywhere near her face or her posture or her voice, because she understood with precision. Because it was her job to understand that every behavior in this building tonight was potentially recorded, potentially relevant, potentially someone's exhibit down the line, and that included her own. She'd identified 3 body cameras in the booking area. The recording quality on the holding cell camera, based on the angle and the vintage of the housing, was probably 1080p, possibly lower. The audio pickup radius on those units typically extended 8 to 12 feet. She was sitting 4 feet from the door. She thought about the notebook. The notebook was in the canvas tote bag that was in the Accord's trunk. The Accord was in impound. The notebook was, she ran through it, legally beyond their reach without a warrant, and they had no grounds for a warrant beyond their own fabricated probable cause, which created a loop that would close itself eventually in her favor. The laptop was encrypted. The folders were labeled with internal case numbering that would mean nothing to anyone without the right clearances. None of it tied directly to what she was doing here until you already knew what she was doing here. She knew that one phone call had gone to the right place. David would sit on it because she'd told him to sit on it, and David Acevedo had been her partner for 6 years and was annoying and precise and would do exactly what she told him to do while worrying loudly about it via text until she got her phone back. The thing she was most careful not to think about, the thing she circled and then deliberately set down, was the look on Derek Colton's face when she told him she hadn't consented to the search. Not anger, something underneath anger, the look of a man who has been questioned in a context where questioning was not allowed, and who had decided to answer that by escalating rather than by considering. She'd seen that face before. She documented it in 15 departments across 6 states over a career that started in civil rights investigations, and had migrated over time into the particular subspecialty of institutional compliance auditing, which was the polite name for the work of identifying systemic patterns in law enforcement misconduct and building the federal record that allowed intervention. She was very good at it. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they are also perpetually disturbed by, in the way that surgeons are said to be good at cutting. She had 43 documented stops attributed to Colton in her preliminary findings. She had statistical modeling from the division analyst showing that Black and Latino drivers were stopped by Colton at 3.7 times the rate of white drivers on comparable roads with comparable traffic. She had 6 complaint records that had been marked as unfounded with no discernible investigation documentation. She had an overtime pattern that suggested systematic falsification of patrol logs. She had not anticipated becoming case number 44. She set the blanket aside, lay down on the bench with her arm under her head, and looked at the ceiling. From the next cell, Terrell Pickett's snoring shifted pitch, settled, continued. Outside, through the building's one high window at the end of the hall, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep blue-gray, and the first insects of morning had started up. And somewhere at a distance a train was moving through, its horn flattened and lonely across the flat parish land. She closed her eyes. Captain Isabella Ruiz arrived at 7:15 in the morning, as she always did, 20 minutes before shift change, coffee from home in a travel mug, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was 51, had been with the department going on 20 years, had made captain by being precise and unshowy and by outlasting people who were louder. She pulled up her email at her desk, scanned subject lines, saw Colton's arrest report notification, and opened it the way she opened everything, with mild expectation of nothing remarkable. She read it once, then again. Then she sat very still for a moment. The problem with Derek Colton's arrest reports was not that they were obviously wrong. The problem was that they were obviously practiced. The language was too consistent, the observations were too standard. Ruiz had flagged this concern internally twice, once in a memo to the previous captain who'd retired, and once in a verbal conversation with the current sheriff, Bo Landry, who'd listened and said he'd look into it and hadn't. She'd considered escalating and had not escalated, and that decision sat with her in the way that unacted upon knowledge tends to sit, not heavily enough to buckle her but not lightly enough to be ignored. She sat looking at the arrest report until 10 minutes past 7. Then she called downstairs. "Desk. Who's in holding?" One male, Terrell Pickett, out since 4 a.m. One female, Renata Vasquez, brought in last night. "Who's processing?" "Day shift will do her bond paperwork." "Don't do anything yet," Ruiz stopped. "Has she had breakfast?" No ma'am." "Get her something from the break room." She hung up. She looked at the arrest report again, at the address on the Arizona license, at the notation that the detainee's phone call had been made to a local 504 number, at the name the detainee had mentioned during the call, which Colton had included in his report because Colton included everything and had learned that thoroughness looked like competence. Hargrove. She typed the name into a search she was authorized to run, a federal liaison database that most of the department used for background verification and she used for everything else. She typed it and then sat back and waited, and the waiting took less than 30 seconds, and what came back made her put her reading glasses down on the desk and press the palms of her hands flat against the surface and breathe through her nose for a moment. Special Agent in Charge Thomas R. Hargrove, FBI New Orleans Field Office, Civil Rights Division. She pulled up the department's civil rights compliance file, the one that documented the notification they'd received 14 months ago about an ongoing federal compliance review of their traffic enforcement patterns. The notification that Sheriff Landry had received, had shared with his command staff including Ruiz, had discussed in a single meeting, and had then essentially folded into a drawer on the grounds that it was a bureaucratic nuisance, and these reviews were routine and everything would be fine. She thought about whether to call Landry first or legal counsel first and decided that in this particular sequence, the order mattered enormously. She called the department's general counsel, Patricia Mouton, who picked up on the second ring and said, "What?" in the tone of a woman who answered all calls before 8 a.m. with that word. Ruiz said, "I need you in here in the next hour." The silence on Mouton's end lasted maybe 4 seconds. "How bad?" "I don't know yet, bring your coffee." By 10 in the morning, cell 2 was empty. They'd released her without fanfare, without additional procedure. Mouton had come into the holding area with Ruiz and Ruiz had introduced herself, fully with her title with more warmth than the occasion strictly required, and had said there'd been a review of the circumstances of the arrest and they wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly, and if she had a moment, if she'd follow them to the conference room. Vasquez had looked at Mouton, then at Ruiz, and she'd said, "Is Sergeant Colton here?" "He's off shift," Ruiz said. "Is he being notified of my release?" The question was asked without inflection. It was asked the way an accountant asks about a line item. "I'll handle the notification," Ruiz said. Vasquez had gathered her things from the property bin: the black leather bag, her phone, her keys, a rubber band, $3 in cash, and had signed the release form and followed them to the conference room without another word. She'd declined coffee. She'd sat with her hands folded and looked at the table for a moment and then looked at Ruiz. Ruiz said, "I'd like to start by saying." "Captain," Vasquez said, not unkindly, "you don't need to start by saying anything." Mouton clicked her pen twice. "Agent Vasquez." "I was wondering," Vasquez said, "whether I could have my vehicle returned. I'd like to check on some materials I had in the trunk." The word materials landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Of course," Mouton said, recovering first. "We'll have it out of impound within the hour." Vasquez nodded. She took her phone from the property bag and turned it on and waited while it loaded. She read something, a text, several texts maybe, and typed 2 words in response and set it down. She was in the conference room for 11 minutes. She answered 3 questions from Mouton, all factual, all brief. She made no speeches. She made no threats. She did not say the words lawsuit, civil rights, or federal. When she left, she shook Ruiz's hand and not Mouton's, which Ruiz thought about for several hours afterward. Derek Colton got the call at 11:45 while he was eating lunch at his kitchen table with the radio on, a college football preview, the volume low. It was Ruiz's extension. He looked at it for 1 ring and then answered. "She's gone," Ruiz said. "What?" "She's been released. I need you to come in." He set his fork down. "What do you mean she's—" "I had a charge. The report is filed." "Derek." The way she said his first name was the way she said it when she'd already decided something and was making space for him to catch up. He'd heard it maybe twice before in all their years together. "Who was she?" he said, not a question exactly. There was a pause. "Come in, please." He sat at the table for 2 minutes after she hung up. The radio kept going. Someone was explaining the defensive prospects of a team in the SEC whose coordinator had left in the offseason. Derek looked at his plate and wasn't hungry. He looked at the window. It was a bright day, still warm, a lizard on the back fence doing push-ups in the sun, and he thought about the way Renata Vasquez had stood behind her car on the Route 9 shoulder with her arms at her sides, not folded, not crossed. Just loose, waiting, like she had as much time as he did. He drove to the station. Mouton was in Ruiz's office when he arrived. That alone told him something. Patricia Mouton didn't leave her office on Baker Street to come to the substation for minor things. He sat down without being asked. That was a habit, sitting. It grounded him. It gave him altitude advantage in small rooms. "Walk me through last night," Ruiz said. He walked them through it. He used the same language he'd used in the report mostly, which was the correct thing to do, consistency, but he also watched Mouton's face while he talked, and what he saw there was not the expression of a person waiting for a story but of a person managing the distance between what they're hearing and what they already know. When he finished, Ruiz was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The residue. In the center console. Did you collect it?" He had not collected it. There was no collection protocol for residue so trace it couldn't be photographed. He'd noted it in the report. It was minimal. "Derek," that tone again, "the vehicle has been returned to her. The trunk materials are with her." She checked them. Both folders were intact, nothing disturbed. "I didn't disturb anything." "I know you didn't." She looked at her desk surface. "Do you know who she is?" He said nothing. "She's a special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. She's been conducting an audit of this department for the past 14 months. An audit," she said, "that includes an examination of your traffic stop records specifically." The lizard on his back fence doing push-ups in the sun. The radio, the football analysis. His daughter's clarinet lesson on Thursday. The commendation plaque on his home office wall. These were not the things he thought about, but they were the things that moved through the room anyway. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know," Ruiz said. "I had probable cause." Mouton uncrossed her legs. "Sergeant Colton, I need you to understand the situation clearly. Special Agent Vasquez has not yet filed a formal complaint. What she has done or what has been done through her office is notify the FBI field office of the incident, which means this is now documented at the federal level. Whether it proceeds further depends on a number of factors. What factors? The most important one, Mouton said, is what this department does next. He looked at Ruiz. She was looking at her desk. Administrative leave, she said. Paid, pending review, starting now. I need your badge and your sidearm. He did not move right away. The buzz of the fluorescence, the flicker on the right panel, the way the light made everything yellow. He unclipped his badge and set it on the desk. He removed the sidearm from his holster and set it beside the badge, cleared the chamber by reflex, unloaded, cleared, old habit, and let go of it. He stood up. Derek, Ruiz said. He stopped at the door. This didn't start last night. It was the closest she came to saying what she meant, which was, I've been watching this for years, which was, I should have stopped this, which was also, you should have stopped this. All of that was in the sentence and none of it was in the sentence. He didn't turn around. He walked out. The weeks that followed had the quality of a long, slow exhalation. The FBI field office in New Orleans issued a press statement 17 days after the incident that confirmed an ongoing civil rights investigation of the Palmetto County Sheriff's Department without naming specific personnel. The Baton Rouge Advocate ran the story on page 7. A regional news blog picked it up and gave it the headline that would travel. FBI agent arrested by officer she was investigating. Officials confirm. And from there it did what stories do in the current era, which is expand rapidly in some directions and get complicated rapidly in others, and get flattened into a simpler version of itself by the people sharing it, and a more complicated version by the people litigating it. Derek Colton's name appeared in the third paragraph of the Advocate's story. It appeared in the first paragraph of everything written after that. He stopped answering his phone after the second day. His wife, Cynthia, took the calls when she could and said he wasn't available and didn't say when he would be, and that was mostly true. He spent a lot of time in the backyard. He fixed a section of fence that had been loose for 2 years. He drove his daughter to her clarinet lesson and sat in the parking lot and listened to him radio and didn't go inside. His attorney, a private criminal defense attorney out of Shreveport named Garrett Hollies who specialized in law enforcement defense and charged accordingly, told him to stop talking to anyone except him and to specifically not give any statements to media or to the department or to any federal investigators without Hollies present. He did not find this difficult. He had nothing to say that felt safe. The federal investigation was conducted with a thoroughness that felt to those being investigated like being eaten slowly. It was not dramatic. There were no midnight raids, no handcuffs in the parking lot. There were requests for records which the department's legal team complied with because non-compliance would have been worse. There were interviews conducted in a conference room at the New Orleans field office with investigators who were polite and precise, and whose politeness contained something that was not warmth. Renata Vasquez was not the lead investigator on the Palmetto County case. She was the witness, and the witness didn't also run the investigation, and the separation was deliberate and appropriate, and she'd insisted on it when Sack Hargrove had tried to ask her opinion about the scope. She'd said, "Tom, I'm the complaining witness, act accordingly." She went back to Tempe for 3 weeks and caught up on 2 other cases and got her car properly detailed. The impound lot had left a smear of grease on the driver's door that had been bothering her, and had dinner twice with her sister and once with David Acevedo and his wife, during which David asked whether she was actually okay, and she said she was and meant most of it. She was called back to New Orleans in November to give a formal statement, which she did, which was 4 hours long and which she approached the way she approached the work generally, methodically, without drama, with the particular kind of patience that is actually a form of aggression in disguise. She was asked at one point whether she believed Sergeant Colton had known her identity when he made the arrest. She said no. She was asked whether, in her professional judgment, that changed anything. She thought about it. She said, "It changes his motive, it doesn't change the conduct." She was asked whether she believed the arrest was targeted at her specifically or whether it was consistent with a pattern of conduct he'd engaged in with other individuals. She said both of those things can be true simultaneously. The investigator across the table wrote something down. Outside the conference room window, the city moved around itself the way New Orleans does in November, slower, cooler, the tourists thinning, the real city showing more of its bones. One more question, the investigator said. She waited. When he put the cuffs on you on the side of the road, what were you thinking? She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone finding words, but the quiet of someone deciding how many of the words they've found to give. I was thinking about posture, she said finally. I was thinking that if I held my wrists at the right angle, it would be a cleaner application and there'd be less bruising. A pause. And I was thinking that it would be very important not to say anything I hadn't thought through completely. Another pause. There wasn't much room between those two thoughts for anything else. The investigator looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. She reached for her water glass, and that was that. The federal grand jury convened in February. Derek Colton was indicted on 3 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, falsification of government records in relation to his traffic stop documentation over a documented period of 4 years, and obstruction of a federal civil rights investigation. The third count was the one that surprised people, including Holly's, because it required the government to argue that Colton had somehow known, or should have known, that his actions that night interfered with an active federal matter, an argument legally arguable and factually complex, in which the government was prepared to make with the 43 traffic stop records, and a statistical analysis from the FBI's Forensic Accounting Division that had traced patterns in his body camera footage, including specifically 14 instances where the camera had been turned off or repositioned in a way inconsistent with department protocol during stops that were subsequently reported as consent searches. The body camera from the night of the Vasquez stop had captured everything correctly. It was one of the cleaner records in the file. Holly's had spent 3 days looking for something to work with and had come back to Colton and said the footage was going to be a problem. Colton had said, "I know what I saw." Holly's had looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard this sentence many times and has decided over the years that the most honest response to it is silence. The bail hearing was quiet. Colton sat at the defense table in civilian clothes, dark jacket, open collar, the clothes of a man trying to look neutral, and listened to the conditions of his release and nodded when appropriate and did not look at the gallery, which contained 2 reporters, a woman he recognized from the sheriff's department's public affairs office who was there on professional obligation and looked it, and in the second row on the right side, Captain Isabella Ruiz. He didn't know what to do with that. He still hadn't decided by the time the hearing ended and he was walking out and she was walking toward the door from the other direction and they were briefly in the same space, 10 feet apart maybe, and she looked at him. It wasn't anything. It wasn't forgiveness or condemnation or apology. It was just acknowledgement. The thing you give someone when you've known them a long time and something has ended, and ending isn't the same as resolution. He walked past her and through the door and into the February sun, which was the pale, weak sun of a Louisiana winter, the kind that gives light without warmth, and he stood on the courthouse steps and took one breath and then another. His attorney was behind him, talking on the phone, reciting schedule details to someone. The traffic on Claiborne moved its ordinary way, indifferent. The trial was set for September. In the intervening months, the Palmetto County Sheriff's Department entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice that required, among other provisions, a complete overhaul of its traffic stop documentation protocols, the implementation of a community oversight board with independent review authority, mandatory implicit bias training for all sworn personnel, and quarterly statistical reporting on stop and search patterns to a federal monitor who would hold that role for a minimum of 5 years. Sheriff Landry announced his retirement in April. He gave a statement praising the department's legacy and thanking the community and said nothing about the consent decree, which was already a public document. The statement was 3 paragraphs. Captain Ruiz was named acting sheriff by the parish council in May. She gave a shorter statement. She said she intended to do the job correctly and that this would sometimes mean doing things differently than they'd been done, and that she was confident the department had the capacity for it. She used the word capacity deliberately, she'd thought about it, because it implied the work was possible without promising the work was done. She cleaned out 2 desk drawers in the sheriff's office and left the third full of the previous occupant's things, which felt like the right amount of fresh start. In late August, Renata Vasquez drove back through Delwood. It was not an official visit. She had no business there. She was driving from Shreveport to Baton Rouge on a longer route than necessary, which she acknowledged to herself was a choice she'd made deliberately, and she didn't examine it much further than that. She'd taken the day personal. September was coming, the trial was coming, and she'd been told by the lead prosecutor, a woman named Adiz Obi who was precise and relentless and whom Vasquez respected, that her testimony would take at most a day, and would focus on the night of the stop rather than on the broader investigation, and that she should be prepared for cross-examination that would try to characterize her as either a provocateur or a liar. Vasquez had said she was familiar with the techniques. Obi had said she knew, but being familiar was different from being ready, and she'd said it in a way that wasn't condescending, just true. Route 9 heading east out of Delwood looked the same. It looked exactly the same. The dollar stores and the title loan places and the one surviving restaurant. The paper mill smell. The heat still hanging on. It was the end of August. It would hang on through October. That was the deal in this part of the country. She drove at the speed limit, which was 35, and then through the zone where she'd been stopped, where the limit was 35 and she'd been going 41, which she had probably been. She'd been tired from the drive and distracted, and she'd probably been going 41. She'd thought about that sometimes. She thought about whether it mattered to the narrative of the thing, and she decided that it didn't, not to the legal facts, not to the pattern, not to what Colton was, and she decided that what it was instead was just the ordinary texture of being a person in the world, which is that you're sometimes doing something minor and wrong, and in an equal world that minor wrong would get you a warning or a $40 ticket and you'd go on. And in the world as it actually existed, the minor wrong was sometimes a door that certain people could open, and whether they opened it depended on things that had nothing to do with your guilt. The shoulder of the road was gravel. She drove past without stopping. She thought about Colton not with hatred, which would have been easier to carry, but with something more granular and harder to name. She thought about the 42 other people in her file. The woman who'd been stopped 3 times in 6 months going to her shift at the hospital. The man whose car had been impounded for what turned out to be a broken brake light, who'd lost his job during the 2 weeks it took to recover the car because he'd had no other way to get there. The 16-year-old boy whose school suspension had been triggered by a school resource officer calling in a police stop that Colton had conducted on the road adjacent to school property. And the boy had been suspended, and the suspension had tripped an attendance threshold, and the attendance threshold had the chain of consequences extended out of the file and into a life, and Vasquez had no way of seeing where it ended. She hadn't met most of them. She'd met 2 as part of the investigative process in a conference room at a community center in Delwood with their attorneys. One of them had looked at her for a long time when they were introduced, Vasquez, FBI, and then had said, "You actually going to do something?" She'd said, "We're trying." He'd said, "That's not what I asked." She'd sat with that. She was still sitting with it. The Honda's AC was on full. The parish road opened up into flatter land where the tree cover thinned and you could see for a long distance in every direction flatness and sky and the occasional water tower or cell antenna, and somewhere to the south the crawfish ponds that sat still and brown in the August heat. She drove for 20 minutes without seeing another car. Then she turned south toward Baton Rouge and drove. The trial lasted 9 days. She testified on the afternoon of the 6th day and the morning of the 7th. She answered questions from Obi in a direct, chronological order, and answered questions from Holly's in the same direct order. And when Holly suggested during cross-examination that she had been aware of Colton's identity before the stop and had deliberately manufactured an opportunity to observe him in the field, she said no. And when he asked whether she'd done anything to provoke the escalation of the stop, she said no. And when he said, in the particular tone of cross-examination that implies incredulity without stating it, that she expected the jury to believe that a trained FBI agent had simply been driving along and been caught up in a routine traffic stop, she said, "Yes, that's what happened." She said it without heat. She said it with the same flat certainty with which she'd said everything else. She watched the jury when she could without being obvious about it. 8 women, 4 men, 3 of the women were taking notes which she'd read somewhere was generally positive for prosecution witnesses, but she didn't know how much weight to give that. One man in the second juror's seat had his arms crossed the entire time she was on the stand. She didn't know what to make of him. She decided not to try. On the 9th day, after closing arguments and after the jury had retired, and after 2 days of deliberation during which Vasquez was in Tempe trying to work and failing intermittently, the verdict came in. Guilty on counts 1 and 2, guilty on count 3. She found out through a text from Obi 3 words, guilty all 3, while she was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She sat there for a while. She was not happy exactly. It was not a happy feeling. It was more like the feeling of having lifted something very heavy for a very long time and then setting it down, and the muscles still holding the shape of the effort, still remembering the weight. She thought about the man in the community center conference room. That's not what I asked. She thought about the boy with the school suspension. She didn't know his name because his records had been juvenile and sealed, and she'd only seen the pattern and not the person. She picked up her phone and called David. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah," she said. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, the silence of 2 people who have worked on something together for a long time and have reached an endpoint that is not quite an ending. Then he said he'd see her Monday, and she said yes, and they hung up. Derek Colton was sentenced 4 months later. He stood at the defense table in the same dark jacket and received a sentence of 31 months in federal custody, a fine, 3 years of supervised release, and a permanent prohibition from serving in any law enforcement capacity. He heard each element of the sentence with his eyes forward and his hands flat on the table in front of him. His wife was in the gallery. His attorney was beside him. His daughter was not there, which was the right decision, and a decision he'd had to make room to support. The judge, a 63-year-old woman named Margaret Thibox, who'd been on the bench for 19 years and who wore her hair in a gray braid and who spoke during sentencing in a tone that contained no performance, said that what had been established in this trial was not merely the story of one night on one road. She said that what the evidence had demonstrated was the accumulation of choices made over years, choices that had compounded in their effect on individuals who would each carry those effects in their own specific ways, and that the law existed to make visible the cost of those choices in terms that were formal and public and documented. She said she hoped the sentence reflected the seriousness of that cost. She did not say he was a monster. She did not use the language of movies or of moral certainty. She spoke the way someone speaks when they understand that justice is a system and not a feeling, and that the system's obligation is to be accurate, and that accuracy is difficult and imperfect and necessary. Colton's attorney said something about appeal. Colton said nothing. He was processed and remanded, and that process was the same process he conducted at the booking desk of the Palmetto County Sheriff's substation on an October night however many months ago. The fingerprints, the photograph, the inventory of personal items, the gray plastic bin, and if he registered that symmetry he gave no sign. He'd learned something in the intervening time, though he couldn't have said exactly when he'd learned it, that the thing about power is not that it changes who you are. It's that it shows over time what you always were, by removing the friction that would otherwise have required you to negotiate. He'd had very little friction for a very long time. He didn't think this constituted insight. He didn't think it excused anything. He thought it was just true, the way most things that were too late to use were just true. They took him out a side door. Renata Vasquez was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She was in Phoenix, in a conference room on the 7th floor of the federal building there, in the middle of a preliminary review of traffic enforcement patterns across a 3-county corridor in the eastern part of the state. She had a laptop, 2 folders, a coffee that was still warm, and a notebook, a new one, different brand than the last, same small, neat hand. The case file in front of her was 18 months old and still building. The statistical picture was early, incomplete, suggestive in a way that required more data to substantiate. She was reading through incident reports. Outside, Phoenix in February was the cool, bright dry that people moved there for, the kind of morning that felt like an opening rather than a middle, though it was both. The mountains to the east were sharp-edged and still snow-capped up high, and the city below them moved in its morning rhythms, ordinary and ongoing. She turned a page. The report she was reading was a traffic stop from 18 months ago on a state route east of Mesa. A woman stopped for a rolling stop at a signaled intersection. The woman's name was Amara Solis. She'd been driving a 4-year-old Toyota Camry registered in her name. She'd been stopped, searched without recorded consent, and detained for 45 minutes before being released without charge. The officer's name was printed in the incident log in the same mechanical font as everything else. Vasquez read it. She wrote something in the notebook. She turned to the next page.